The daughter of a popular Japanese manga artist and Taiwanese idol became the target of a group of ruthless kidnappers. The misconduct, mishandling, exploitation, and horrific details of her case went on to change an entire nation. A man named Asaka Takamori, who went by the pen name of Ikki Kajiwara, was an artist in Japan who mainly worked throughout the 70s and 80s. To be more specific, he was a manga artist, writer, illustrator, and film producer all in one. Out of all the content he made, he was mainly known for his work on various sports and martial arts manga. Out of each series he made, he was mainly known for a series called Tiger Mask, which seems to have gotten pretty popular throughout the wrestling community. Despite being the son of an illustrator himself, Kajiwara didn't really look like he had the brightest future coming up ahead of him. He was actually pretty much just a thug in his youth, showing little interest in anything other than fighting with his classmates. After World War II, though, his family moved out to Tokyo. He jumped from school to school, never really finding much success until he got a job as a novelist, of all things, when he was only 17 years old. This was when he started writing for a couple of different magazines as well, forcing him to come up with a couple of different pen names so that it didn't leak that he was actually working for multiple competing magazines. Pai Shuha was born after World War II in 1955 to be exact. She was a singer, actress, later social activist from Taiwan. She was what you could consider to be a proto-influencer at the time, a face that was always active within the media. Although she was born to a very poor family and dropped out of school, she found success in other ways. In the 70s, she won a singing contest held by Taiwan Television. This motivated her to pursue a more media-based career. She adopted a stage name, Bing Bing, which she is still known by to this day. Shortly after starting her career, she moved out to Japan to study acting and brush up on her singing. This was when she ran into Ikki Kajiwara. The two quickly hit it off and got married. In 1980, they had a daughter together, Pai Xiaoyang. Things weren't all too happy for very long. Kajiwara was working on a new wrestling biography series from 1980 to 1983, but it didn't end in the best of ways. Kajiwara ended up with a highly publicized case of assault on his plate, not to mention domestic abuse allegations. This arrest led his family to distance themselves from him and to his new wrestling series getting cancelled for good. To really pile on, he was also being accused of having an affair with a different actress. Kajiwara basically became an outcast in Japanese society. Nobody would work with him, and his family definitely didn't want anything to do with him any longer. His family turmoil was all over the news wherever you happened to look. His celebrity status was as good as gone, and his works were appearing out in public less and less. Within the next year, his marriage to Bing Bing was over. Pai Bingbing decided to go back to Taiwan altogether and raise her daughter, Xiaoyan, by herself. Things weren't going all too badly for the two, though. Bingbing had only been gaining popularity as an actress, finding her niche in comedy, becoming one of the best-known entertainers of her time. She also started making pretty hefty investments into local business, mainly a catering company that was serving her pretty well. Back home in Japan, outcast from society, Xiaoyan's father, Kajiwara, decided to start writing his own autobiography, talking about his rough childhood, his inspirations, his relationships, and his meeting with all of his favorite wrestlers. However, in 1987, when he was only 50 years old, while still working on the book, he suddenly died of pancreatitis. This, while definitely sad, didn't seem to impact the lives of his daughter or ex-wife very much. Bingbing continued her career the same as ever, getting only more successful if anything. Xiaoyang even debuted as an actress herself, acting alongside her mother from time to time. This mother-daughter fame, though, would go on to catch the eyes of some truly unsavory individuals. On the morning of April 14th in 1997, Pai Xiaoyan was heading out to her school, Xingwu High School, just as if it were any other day. She never did show up to school, though. Her mother, none the wiser, was in a recording session as if it were just any other normal day. The monotony was broken when she got a phone call from a very drunken-sounding man, speaking through slurred speech, telling her that he had kidnapped her daughter. Bingbing listened as this man told her to go out to a certain nearby golf course and look for her daughter's belongings as proof of his claims. He told her that if she called the police, her daughter would be killed and that would be that. She tried to play it cool, but her coworker noticed that something was wrong pretty immediately. Despite what she was told, the coworker urged her to call the police, which she did. Together with them, she went out to the golf course to try to find the bag containing her daughter's belongings that the kidnappers had mentioned. Eventually, after what was described as hours of searching, she came across the belongings in a normal plastic shopping bag on the ground. Inside, she made several horrific discoveries. Not only were some of Xiaoyun's belongings in the bag as she expected, she also came across a ransom note demanding what would have been about $5 million at the time, a little over $9 million in today's money. Under the note, though, she found something even worse. A photograph of her daughter, half naked and tied up with duct tape. And then, lastly, she came across a small, cylindrical object that she didn't quite recognize at first. It didn't take too long before she came to the realization that this was a finger, her daughter's finger. The police, trying to play by the book in the interest of the hostage's safety, decided not to go to the media with this case just yet. It was in their protocols that a hostage situation shouldn't be reported until the police have a pretty good grasp on what's going on. But it didn't take too long before the media to realize that Bing Bing, a very common face, had gone completely radio silent for a while now. This was very unusual for her, and it definitely raised some eyebrows. While Bing Bing and the police were trying to find Xiaoyun and negotiate with her kidnappers, the celebrity gossip news media were already putting the pieces together to try to get in on this scoop. Regardless of how much the police tried to keep the ordeal a secret, the reporters couldn't help but put a piece together about what was guaranteed to be one hell of a media circus. The police were very unhappy. This completely violated their guidelines against reporting a kidnapping/hostage situation before the incident had been resolved. All while this was going on, Bing Bing and the police had made several attempts to get the money to the kidnappers in one way or another. Each time, though, the drop-offs were called off at the last moment when the kidnappers would spy either the police or the news media lurking nearby. This was when the kidnappers, furious, decided to let Xiaoyun call her mother herself, amping up the fear factor, with her daughter screaming, "Stop it. Mom, save me. I just want to see you. I don't want to die," before the phone was once again taken away. More and more attempts were made to exchange the cash, but at some point the kidnappers had gotten frustrated that Bing Bing had violated the one condition they gave her, not contacting the police. The phone calls from the kidnappers abruptly stopped one day. This was when the police really began to accept that time was not on their side. At this point, they were facing the reality that, more than likely, they weren't going to get Xiaoyun back alive. After so many communications with the kidnappers, though, the police were finally able to determine the location of their hideout. As soon as they knew, they went out and started raiding the building. After a firefight between the police and the kidnappers, only one of the criminals was arrested, with the other two escaping and fleeing off into the night. As they searched the hideout, they came to realize that Xiaoyun was nowhere to be found. It would be a few days until a local resident called the police on April 28th with a discovery. Someone was floating down in a drainage ditch coming off from a river below. The police came out to find Xiaoyun's body, weighed down with some dumbbells floating in the water. The corpse was said to have been so badly beaten, decayed, and bloated that the police refused to let anyone see it. An autopsy determined that the cause of death was internal organ rupture due to continued assault, along with massive blood loss. As bad of condition as she was in, she was easily identified by the missing finger. It appeared that she had been tortured and violated for a period of time before being disposed of. It was found that she had been dead for roughly 10 days at this point, with it having only been 14 days since she was kidnapped. This brought the police to a truly horrific realization. Xiaoyun had already been dead throughout most of the negotiations. Worse than that, the voice that they had heard on the phone, calling for her mother, couldn't have been her. The kidnappers, already having killed her, must have gotten someone to impersonate her voice during those moments. With the media dying to get their grubby little hands on this case just one more time, sadly the photos of her body leaked out, being printed in various mainstream publications, including the China Times, for all to see. Partially due to the horrific details of this case, and partially due to Pai Bingbing's level of fame and beloved status, this case sparked outrage all across the nation of Taiwan. People had become very concerned about their safety and about the apparent decline in law and order across the country. Polls taken around this time showed that over 90% of mothers feared for the safety of their children. Approval ratings for government officials plummeted, becoming the lowest that they had been in quite some time. A lot of people felt that this kidnapping wasn't merely a one-off case. They felt that violent crime, especially crime involving children, had only been increasing. 8 different media organizations who published pictures of Xiaoyun's body were heavily criticized and condemned while protesters marched throughout May of 1997, demanding Premier Lian Chan's resignation from his position. This crime was only the breaking point after a long string of unsolved violent crimes in recent years that left the public very unsatisfied with their leadership, to put it lightly. After the raid on the kidnappers' hideout, 12 accessories to the crimes came to be arrested. 3 of the main criminals, including the 2 who had escaped during the raid, were still on the run somewhere. The 3 remaining criminals that the police were hunting were Cao Tianmin, Lin Chunsheng, and Chen Qianxing. While on the run, these 3 men would brazenly go on to commit multiple other crimes, including over 20 sexual assaults and even more kidnappings. The problem was, the police in Taiwan didn't really have the greatest skills when it came to forensics at the time. Unless the criminals were caught in the flesh, they weren't likely to be tracked very well. Knowing that neither time nor the public were on their side, the police handed down orders to kill any of these criminals on the spot without warning if they showed any sort of resistance. While on the run from the police, the 3 men kidnapped the Taipei County Councilor on June 3rd and robbed him of over $6 million. Then, in August, they kidnapped a local businessman and took a ransom from his family. His family, out of fear, had paid the ransom in full without contacting the police. Finally, on August 19th, the police were able to track the 3 men to Wuchang Street in Taipei. They weren't going to go down easily, though, resulting in a hail of gunfire between the 2 parties. Being shot 6 times and feeling that he was done for, Lin turned the gun on himself and ended his life on the spot. 1 police officer was killed in the battle, with another being wounded as well. Backup arrived as quickly as possible and the neighborhood was combed through, but nothing of importance was found. Chen and Cao had escaped. Chen and Cao, still on the run, continued their crime spree the same as ever. 2 months later, on October 23rd, the 2 kidnapped a plastic surgeon, his wife, and his nurse and forced them to perform plastic surgery on them. After the surgeries were over, they shot all 3 of them. They then continued their run together. In early November, Cao was spotted by the police while out in public. When the police attempted to capture him, much like his cohort Lin, he turned the gun around and ended himself. Chen, however, the worst of the 3 men, still continued to evade the police. The longer he got away with his crimes, the more emboldened he became. He kidnapped and violated a good number of women during this period, even looking them in the eyes and telling them, "I am Chen Qianxing," just to see the look of horror on their faces. This all came to a climax on November 18th, when Chen broke into the home of a man named Colonel Edward McGill Alexander, the South African military attaché to Taipei. Chen had only one goal in mind. By now, the police had arrested his wife, his brother-in-law, and several of his other friends and relatives for being accomplices to his crimes. In order to get a deal with the police, Chen knew that he had to take some hostages. He couldn't think of any better way to get immediate attention than by causing an international incident by holding foreign government officials at gunpoint. Chen, breaking into the home, put a gun to the head of the colonel's 12-year-old daughter. Within minutes, he had the colonel, his 2 daughters, his wife, and his infant son at his mercy. He then went on to hold the whole family hostage for a full 20 hours. The media vultures, as usual, were loving this. Cameras were on the home non-stop as Chen and the police communicated back and forth. All night, Chen gave interviews to TV and radio personalities over the colonel's phone. Some of them even went as far as to ask him to sing for them over the radio. Another reporter flat out told Chen that he should end himself then and there, something that angered him greatly. The police, afraid of angering him even more, were afraid to make this circus stop. The police themselves, though, were refusing to speak to Chen on the phone, instead only speaking with the hostages. They only spoke to Chen by yelling at him from outside the home, enraging him. Eventually, they started shooting. In the end, 3 firefights broke out between Chen and the police. 160 spent shell casings were found on the ground around where Chen stood alone. The colonel, Alexander, and his daughter, Melanie, were both injured by gunfire during the firefights. The massive crowd of photographers, reporters, and news vans prevented them from getting to an ambulance in a reasonable amount of time. While they finally did get to the hospital, the rest of the family were still stuck in the home, completely at Chen's mercy. After a long negotiation process, Chen eventually surrendered to the police. He gave a complete confession to both Pai Xiaoyun's kidnapping and to a lengthy list of other crimes, including 18 sexual assaults that he himself would admit to, telling the police clearly that there were likely much more that he didn't even remember. Completely out of left field, Chen decided to convert to Christianity in prison, seemingly becoming fairly devout. There are a few possible reasons as to why this came about. For one, the colonel's family continually prayed and remained peaceful while held at gunpoint in the home, something that may have stuck with him. One of the daughters even gave Chun a drawing of a cross during this period. The colonel's wife, Anne, even hugged him and forgave him at the time of his surrender. The two even visited him in prison after his arrest and gave him a Bible. Eventually, he was baptized. Whether or not he was serious about turning his life around, it was a little late now. Being that he had already been arrested and he was already behind very tight security in a maximum security prison, his chances of hurting someone else were pretty low. It's really impossible to know exactly how serious he took this new outlook on life. It's very possible that he might have just been looking for some sort of way to get some sympathy or lenience. We'll never know. In December of 1998, Chun was officially convicted for the kidnappings, murders, and numerous sexual assaults over the last year. In 1999, he was finally executed for his crimes. Ever since the enormous backlash that the media came to face for running the photos of Xiaoyun's body, the Taiwanese media now has new standards in place that prohibit the publishing of real, graphically violent images such as those. When asked about whether or not improvements had been made to the police force since the hostage crises, the assistant director of the criminal police said that they had absolutely learned their lesson when it came to multiple points. For one, they adopted multiple new measures to further ensure the safety of hostages whenever something like this might happen again. For instance, the police were always required to fire at least one warning shot before ever engaging in a firefight, regardless of the level of danger at hand, wasting precious time. Given that a police officer had died in one of these firefights and that multiple hostages had come to be injured, they decided it was time to get rid of this arbitrary rule and focus on solving the problem more efficiently. Pai Bingbing, now in old age, has become a strong advocate for the death penalty, starting her own foundation to advocate for capital punishment as well as to give free legal aid to various crime victims. It's safe to say that she has reached a very different sort of fame that she once had. She went from a bright, funny, wholesome personality to someone with a much darker, melancholy atmosphere. However, she feels that this new sort of fame carries much more meaning and purpose. To this day, she still leads protests against the anti-capital punishment movement. It's said that her protests played a big part in the resumption of executions within Taiwan. Things are still dark in her life, though. Even in her later years, she's still forced to relive the death of her daughter time and time again. Just recently on social media, a flood of trolls told her that she deserved to, quote, die in the water just like her child. This was in response to nothing more than a video she had posted on Facebook in memorial of her daughter. This trolling ended up being the result of one single internet user in the end. Bingbing is pursuing pressing charges for harassment against her. She said, "I spent 15 years wiping out the memories of when my daughter was found, and that user's comment managed to provoke them again." Years after Xiaoyun died, Bingbing tried, with no success, to have another child via in vitro fertilization, really making that loss hit harder just that much more. Once again, thank you for watching my video. If you found this video interesting, please give it a like, it helps me out in the algorithm, and feel free to subscribe if you want to see more content like this. If you want, go ahead and follow me on social media as well. I mean, you know how YouTube is with channels like this. If anything would ever happen to me, that would probably be the only way you'd ever hear about it. If you want to support the channel even further, I do have a Patreon account which I always keep linked down in the description below, where you can see videos early, ad-free, and uncensored. Speaking of which, shout out to the top patrons. We have Anna B, Sunrider, Gabrielle Tansig, Lee aka Crust, Amelia Morales, Minnie Tina, Ron Murillo, Travis Billings, Lettuce, Jason Whitehurst, Lord Fool, Jim Dowell, Kimmy Leffel, Melina Lee Williams-Haas, Motaz Hawk, Impalato, Steph and Jamie Kramer, Max Sword Guy, Rain Noir, Pao Yang, April Diamond, Starfade, Astral, Angie, Rick of Work in Progress USA, Sash Johnson, Marianne McCurdy, Buttery Frankus, Jules Latona, Arctic Cat, Adrian Lawley, Marsh, Rinsenstein, Kim Peak, Lex Luthor, Lux Alpaca, Charity, Scoochie Main, Jackie, and Mark Barnett. You are all Mondo Cool. This has been your host Kyle, thank you, and good night.